Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Sam & Max Hit the Road, a point-and-click adventure title developed and published by LucasArts and released for MS-DOS computers in 1993, with a port to macOS following in 1995, and eventually a re-release for Windows in 2002. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 133, and this is another special episode because it is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one was sponsored by Rich Senewald. Rich did record a message for all of us to listen to about why he chose Sam & Max for today's episode. So Rich, take it away.
Several years had passed since our hero Twinson defeated Dr. Funfrock, and peace had returned to the land. Our hero, wife now pregnant and expecting, is thrown... Oh, hang on. Oh, we're not doing this one. It's okay. Sorry. Sorry. Hang on. My sponsored episode this week is Sam & Max Hit the Road. Now, the CGT Discord is usually actually quite full of people talking about point-and-click adventure games. They seem to be very popular. So I was shocked to learn that not only did Tony used to pretty much dedicate himself to playing point-and-click adventure games, but he had never played Sam & Max Hit the Road. And I played Sam & Max a lot, around the time everyone was playing the other point-and-click adventure games, Day of the Tentacle, Monkey Island, etc. The game was just good. It wasn't particularly difficult, it wasn't particularly long, but it actually had a significant amount of replayability due to the mini-games inserted in it. Was highway surfing, and I played Dress Up Max a lot. Max is a very important character. Sam is a very important character. I don't really want to spoil anything, because if you've not played Sam & Max, it's just a wonderfully odd game, and it spawned so many sequels recently, especially down the line. None of them really touch the original Hit the Road game, which still stands up today as enjoyable, quirky, silly, just well worth a look. So enjoy. I'm very excited to hear what Tony thought of this game and the story behind it, because I do not know much about the history of how the game came to be. How do you come up with two main characters, one of which is a complete insane rabbit, buddy cop adventure straight-talking detective dog? I don't know.
Thank you, Rich, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon, and it's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean, Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago. We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the pantheon of classic gaming. If a game reaches the pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Sam and Max Hit the Road. Sam and Max Hit the Road is a point-and-click adventure title developed and published by LucasArts for the MS-DOS computer platform in 1993, with a port to Mac OS following in 1995, and eventually a Windows release later in 2002. Before we can talk about Sam and Max, we need to take a step back and talk about the game's creator, Steve Purcell, an incredibly talented individual who, over the course of his lifetime, has performed in a variety of creatively focused roles, including working as a cartoonist, comic strip illustrator, animator, film director, and, of course, game designer, just to name a few of the creative endeavors Purcell has pursued during his personal free time and professional careers. And, as we'll see, this combination of experiences, skills, and interests is why Purcell would become an obvious choice to eventually join the LucasArts adventure game team, a group of similarly talented creative visionaries who would end up evolving into one of the most well-respected adventure game development studios of all time. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to truly understand why Purcell would eventually join the LucasArts team, and why the duo of Sam and Max would even become a game in the first place, we need to go back to Purcell's childhood, a period of time that saw his latent artistic talents begin to blossom. Purcell, like many artistically talented individuals, had always loved to draw, and he began creating quote-unquote artwork pretty much as soon as his fine motor skills allowed him to pick up and use a pencil and a set of crayons. In fact, Purcell has mentioned in various interviews that he still has art and drawings that he created from his earliest 3 years of age, which honestly, I would love to get a peek at, because I know the limitations of my own artistic talents, and I'm super curious if Purcell as a 3-year-old was able to draw better than a 43-year-old, mostly grown up, though decidedly still not adult, man. Mild curiosity aside, it turns out that Steve Purcell's younger brother, Dave Purcell, had similar artistic talents, and it wasn't uncommon to see the two young brothers working independently on their own art and early comic strip-like creations, while also occasionally dipping their toes into a form of good-natured sibling rivalry focused on attempting to one-up, and occasionally derail, each other's artistic efforts. Steve, as the older brother, would often find his younger brother's drawings and half-completed comic strips scattered about their family's house. And Steve, being an older brother, took it upon himself to improve, so to speak, Dave's art. oftentimes augmenting his brother's comic strips with a series of parody-inspired scenes, including ridiculous situations where Dave's characters would break the fourth wall and complain about how poorly they had been drawn, mismatched character dialogues and names where individual characters would begin to wonder who the heck they even were, and other alterations that allowed the older Purcell to assert his age-granted dominance over his younger sibling. Interestingly, though, despite Steve Purcell's desire to make his younger brother's life just a little bit miserable, as all older brothers are almost required to do to their younger siblings, Steve would occasionally look at Dave's artwork and think to himself that the characters Dave was creating were actually pretty darn interesting. And over time, Steve began to consider that mocking work that he actually respected was perhaps not the best demonstration of brotherly love. Instead, Steve would begin to take characters Dave created and use them as the basis of his own stories and comic strips, effectively transplanting Dave's characters into Steve's worlds, complete with brand new situations, scenarios, and oftentimes comedic quandaries for those characters to solve. And speaking of those characters, while Dave had created a number of different personas for his comic strip denizens over the years, there was one specific duo that Steve really thought had potential. Dave had, at some point in his childhood years, come up with the concept of a police detective duo made up of an anthropomorphic rabbit and dog who worked together to solve crimes and defeat evildoers, oftentimes dealing with somewhat normal situations that Dave's older brother would end up transforming with increasingly outlandish conclusions and storylines. This crime-fighting comic duo, who Dave named Sam and Max, formed the foundation of a number of Dave's early half-completed comic strips, and by extension would form the foundation of a number of Steve's own comic capers. Now, interestingly, despite the fact that the two Purcells were brothers and seemingly had a good, albeit competitive, relationship, there could have potentially been some issues with Steve continuing to use Dave's creations, especially as Steve began to transition from focusing on hobbyist comic art into becoming an actual semi-professional comic strip artist. Steve continued to use the Sam and Max characters in his own personal work, and while none of his early comic strips with the duo had been formally published, he had high hopes that he would be able to eventually use Sam and Max in his own published comics in the future. Unfortunately for Steve, though, even his big brother status wouldn't have protected him from the realities of copyright law, and technically, Sam and Max were Dave Purcell's creation. Even though Dave was mostly fine with Steve using those characters in his personal work, transitioning those characters to a published and therefore potentially commercial endeavor was a different matter entirely, and even the strongest of relationships can be strained when the concepts of ownership and money come into play. Luckily for all involved, though, Dave Purcell was a pretty awesome younger brother who realized that Steve had taken his original creations and effectively made them his own, and Dave, for his part, was truly interested to see if Steve could turn Sam and Max into an actual successful comic strip duo. So, as a present for one of Steve's teenage birthdays, Dave drew up a handwritten contract and, without a second thought, signed over all of the rights to the two characters to Steve, making it so that any future Sam and Max comic strips, whether published or otherwise, would be entirely and legally under Steve's creative control. Even though the legalities of character ownership never really impacted Steve and Dave's relationship, or prevented Steve from creating his own comic strips with the characters, the fact that Steve now had legitimate and recognized ownership over Sam and Max was a springboard for him to pursue more formal comic strip artistry, an ambition that would be recognized while he was attending the California College of the Arts in 1980. At the time, Steve had joined the college's newspaper staff as a comic editor, and shortly after becoming a member of the staff, he was faced with a tight deadline that required him to come up with a fresh new comic strip for inclusion in that week's publication. Working through the night, the evening before the paper was set to be printed, Purcell ended up creating a comic strip featuring his favorite pair of crime-fighting mammalians, Sam and Max, and submitted that strip to the paper to hopefully be published in that week's issue. Well, it turns out that the paper's editing team loved Purcell's work, and in that week's edition of the college's newspaper, Sam and Max would make their official debut as a formally published comic strip. While this Sam and Max publication would be the first time the duo would officially appear in print, it would be far from the last, as Purcell would go on to draw and write a number of other Sam and Max comic strips over the period of time he spent in college, with new strips regularly appearing in the weekly edition of the college's newspaper. And the crazy antics of the crime-fighting duo would begin to garner a bit of a fan base amongst Purcell's fellow college peers. This growing popularity kept Sam and Max as a regular newspaper feature until 1982, which is when Purcell graduated from college and began to turn his attention to beginning an actual career. And given his past experiences and desires, that meant one thing. Purcell wanted to become a professional comic strip artist. There was just one issue with that goal. The major comic publishers of the time, like Marvel and DC, weren't really looking to augment their staff with a young, relatively unproven artist, as each had a very well-established staff of writers and illustrators who continuously churned out new and exciting comic books featuring a number of incredibly popular and bankable characters on a regular basis. Companies like Marvel and DC weren't looking for something new around this time, but they would occasionally outsource illustration work for those comics to independent artists, a form of short-term labor that a number of companies in need of supplemental artwork for their own creative endeavors would similarly employ. While the companies Purcell was pursuing may not have been interested in hiring him to an on-staff position at the time, there was still recognition that Purcell was a talented artist. And this fact is what led Purcell to begin working as a freelance illustrator who, over several years, would end up working with a number of comic book publishers and other companies, including comic book giant Marvel, tabletop gaming company Chaosium, and, most pertinent to our discussion, Fish Wrap Productions, a publishing company that was founded by fellow comic illustrator and cartoonist Steve Moncuse. In 1985, Moncuse had an idea for an original comic book entitled Fish Police, featuring an anthropomorphic fish detective who, over a series of different adventures, would end up having to solve various crimes committed by the other human-like sea creatures that made up the comic book's world. Over a series of 11 issues that his company, Fish Wrap Productions, self-published between 1985 and 1987, Moncuse would deliver a well-drawn, engaging comic-styled adventure that many fans, including a good portion of the critical comic community, grew to love. As the popularity of Fish Police continued to rise and the fan base for Moncuse's work continued to increase, he became interested in expanding Fish Wrap Productions' portfolio to include a second comic book series, one that Moncuse hoped would be as successful as his prior work. There was just one issue. Moncuse was still 100% dedicated to working on Fish Police, as well as the potential for republishing and enhancing the comic's original 11-issue run, and he didn't have the bandwidth to devote time to creating a brand new comic book series himself. Moncuse recognized that if he wanted to publish a new and distinct series of comic books, he was going to need to work with another talented comic book writer and artist, someone who he'd be able to trust to create a comic book with the same level of quality and attention to detail that Moncuse had infused into his own work. As luck would have it, Moncuse had become aware of Steve Purcell's work over the years, even contracting with him to complete some pencil drawings for several Fish Police issues, and he had been very impressed with both Purcell's artistic ability as well as his unique off-the-wall style of humor, both of which Moncuse believed would be the perfect blend to include in the new standalone comic book series that Moncuse hoped to be able to publish. With that goal in mind, Moncuse met with Purcell to ask if he'd be interested in working together to bring a brand new original comic book series to life, one that would give Purcell the freedom to bring his own ideas and creative vision into the world. Purcell listened to the pitch and considered his options, thinking back to his prior experience working in the comic book and illustrative art industry. Over the years following Purcell's graduation from college, he had remained gainfully employed doing freelance art and comic work, but he had never had the opportunity to truly work on something that was solely his own creation. Most of Purcell's post-college work was dedicated to bringing other people's artistic and creative visions to life, and while he enjoyed those projects, he still felt restricted by the fact that he couldn't fully express his own creativity and ideas. Which is why, after Steve Moncuse offered Purcell the opportunity to create his own comic book series, it didn't take long for him to agree to the proposal. The only question was, what would Purcell's brand new comic book series be focused on? Nah, I'm kidding. There was really never any question as to what Purcell was going to use as the inspiration for his new comic book. No, it was pretty much a given that only one set of characters could potentially fit the bill for his first solo comic book outing, a duo of crime fighters that Purcell had drawn and written stories for ever since he was a teenager. That duo, of course, was none other than Sam and Max. The first Sam and Max comic book was published by Fish Wrap Productions in 1987 and featured two stories: Monkeys Violating the Heavenly Temple and Night of the Gilded Heron Shark, both of which would introduce the world to the outlandish antics of the Sam and Max characters and the comic universe that they both inhabited, a freshman effort that would be followed up with a number of other Sam and Max stories and comic books released over the next several years. Interestingly though, while Purcell loved working on Sam and Max comics and was truly grateful for the opportunity to create his own series of comic books, a different, semi-related opportunity would present itself in 1988 that would end up changing the trajectory of both Steve Purcell's career, as well as the dynamic duo of Sam and Max, forever. Like I had mentioned, after Purcell graduated from college in 1982, he spent the next few years acting as a freelance illustrator, working both with comic book publishers like Marvel Comics, as well as with other companies, some of which were in the computer and tabletop gaming industries, where he ended up designing the cover art for a number of game boxes. Despite the fact that, at least to the best of my knowledge, Purcell didn't work on any computer game artwork for well-known blockbuster releases, his overall talent still shone through anytime he provided illustrations and artwork for a project. So much so that his work on those game boxes, as well as his continued comic book artistry, would garner the attention of Lucasfilm Games, the interactive gaming division of George Lucas's 1980s film and media empire, and the predecessor to the company that would eventually become rebranded as LucasArts. In 1988, after observing Purcell's impressive artistic talents, Lucasfilm reached out to Purcell with a job offer. The company wanted him to join their team as an animator to work on an upcoming project, with the added perk that Purcell could continue working on other freelance opportunities as time allowed. Basically, it was the best of both worlds. Purcell could continue to develop his Sam and Max comic books and could even work on other creative endeavors outside of his day job, while having the benefit of maintaining employment at a rapidly expanding company that, although not known at the time, was about to become one of the most popular developers of adventure games in the entire computer game industry. Purcell figured this was an offer too good to pass up, so he decided to join Lucasfilm Games and began working on their up to this point unannounced project. Unfortunately for Purcell, though, that employment opportunity would be short-lived, as the project for which he was hired would be cancelled shortly after he joined the Lucasfilm team, and with no other projects in his work queue, Purcell was unceremoniously laid off just a couple of months after he was initially hired. Now, to be clear, the fact Purcell was hired and then fired in rapid succession was not in any way related to a lack of skill or work ethic on his part. The simple fact was, if a newly hired employee didn't have meaningful work to occupy their time, then it didn't really make any business sense to keep that individual employed with the company, which is why Lucasfilm ended up firing Purcell before he even really had a chance to get settled in at his new job. In a strange twist of fate, though, a number of additional opportunities within Lucasfilm Games would arise that would ironically drive the company to rehire Purcell shortly after he was fired, which honestly must have been a bit of a roller coaster ride of emotions for Purcell. Think about it. You get hired by a company, fired by that company, and then rehired by that same company, all over a period of several months. I can't imagine what that must have felt like, and I know I personally would have been a bit irritated at the fickleness of a company that couldn't even decide whether they wanted me to work at the company. Purcell, for his part though, was a consummate professional and was completely undeterred, as he was simply happy to continue his working relationship with Lucasfilm Games, who at the time were readying several adventure game releases that would end up being incredibly influential in the rapidly evolving computer game market. Those being Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders and Maniac Mansion. Purcell was rehired to work on various in-game and box artwork for both titles, and after he completed work on those games, Lucasfilm recognized, very clearly, that they were 100% right in bringing Purcell back into the company. After that initial work, Purcell would be tapped to work on a variety of Lucasfilm and eventually LucasArts projects, including Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Loom, Monkey Island 1 and 2, and Zombies Ate My Neighbors, just to name a few of the titles that Purcell contributed to. Beyond those game-specific efforts, though, Purcell would end up having an even greater impact on the company through the introduction of a couple of wisecracking characters into the LucasArts culture. Those being, of course, Sam and Max. After Purcell was hired back into the company, and before he went off to begin working on a number of LucasArts' future adventure titles, several members of the art team at LucasArts had come to Purcell to discuss his recently published Sam and Max comic book series, a creative focus that Purcell continued to work on in his spare time, even after becoming a full member of the LucasArts staff. The art staff at LucasArts loved Sam and Max, so much so that they wanted to see the duo become official LucasArts characters in a variety of projects that the company was about to work on. At this point in our story, those projects did not include an actual game, but they did include a variety of other tangential efforts that would serve to thrust Sam and Max into a more prominent position within the company. One of those efforts was a very internally focused initiative, and that was how to help budding adventure game designers learn to use the official LucasArts adventure game toolset, which in the post-Maniac Mansion world meant using the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, or SCUM, engine. After Ron Gilbert and several other developers created that engine, it became the standard for almost all future adventure games that LucasArts would work on, and because of that fact, the company needed to figure out how to train new employees on the use of the tool. This resulted in the creation of the LucasArts SCUM University, which was an internal training program for future SCUM engine adventure game designers, a group of employees who were affectionately labeled SCUMlets, while attending the in-house training sessions. As part of that training program, prospective game designers would be tasked with using the SCUM engine to accomplish various fairly standard adventure game interactions, like figuring out how to make a character interact with an object in an environment, or how to make a character walk from one portion of the screen to the next, along with playing the appropriate animations for those movements. These budding game designers, though, weren't all artistically inclined, and the fact is, being able to draw characters and animate them wasn't really a requirement to design a high-quality adventure game experience. Adventure game designers needed to know how to make meaningful and engaging puzzles, conceptualize stories, and write dialogue for characters, but actually creating the artwork for those characters? That was the purview of the art team, a team that included comic book artist, illustrator, and now video game development studio employee, Steve Purcell. One day, Purcell was approached and asked to create a series of set stock characters that could be used during those SCUM engine training sessions, and he considered that it might be fun to use Sam and Max as the characters embedded within those training materials. So Purcell sat down and created digital representations of both Sam and Max, providing a number of action-based animations for both, and even creating a virtual office environment that the pair could interact with, effectively making a sandbox for future game developers to play in. Interestingly, this had an unintended side effect beyond the core focus of providing training materials for future game developers. Including Sam and Max as characters within its official SCUM training courses made it so that Sam and Max began to become a part of the company's culture, and honestly, it's not really hard to see why. Assume you're a brand new LucasArts employee, and you, like any new hire, have to go through a number of different training courses, technical and otherwise, to begin learning how to use the tools and processes that the company has created. If you sit down and begin taking those training courses, and you begin to see the same characters reused in a number of different scenarios, you might start to think that the characters are effectively like mascots with the company, even if, as in the case of Sam and Max, the characters had never been associated with an official LucasArts consumer product up to this point. And in fact, Sam and Max's characters were still exclusively owned by Steve Purcell. There was no true linkage to LucasArts at the time, other than their inclusion in the SCUM training materials. Even beyond that, Purcell had continued to feature Sam and Max in various comic books that he was still actively creating while working with LucasArts, completely unrelated to LucasArts as a company. The fact that Sam and Max began to be associated with LucasArts, at least internally, was simply a happy accident, and one that Purcell, for his part, was fully supportive of. From his perspective, any additional recognition of his work and characters was a good thing, even if there was no official, or at least outwardly facing connection between LucasArts and Sam and Max. Sam and Max's relationship with LucasArts would become a bit more quote-unquote official beginning in 1990, which is when LucasArts decided to begin publishing their own magazine, The Adventurer. The Adventurer was effectively an advertisement for LucasArts products, similar in some ways to Nintendo's own Nintendo Power magazine, and was often included as an extra in the boxed copies of various games that LucasArts would release. The Adventurer was used as a means of informing gamers about the products they were playing, offering some light behind-the-scenes features for LucasArts' most popular titles, as well as previewing future releases that the company was working on. It was basically an advertisement for the company, sure, but it certainly was an effective one. The Adventurer also included a number of other short articles and featurettes for readers to explore, and one idea that was floated around by members of the magazine staff was the potential for including a comic strip in some of the issues, intended to be a means of parodying some of LucasArts' most popular products, like those featuring Star Wars and Indiana Jones. The only issue was, beyond the general concept of parodying LucasArts game and film properties, there wasn't much in the way of content planned for the comic strip, nor was there an understanding of who they would ask to create comic strips for eventual inclusion in the magazine. As luck would have it though, someone on LucasArts staff was in fact a professional comic strip artist and creator, that being obviously Steve Purcell. It didn't take long before LucasArts decided to leverage Purcell's talents to create comic strips for The Adventurer, and here the decision was made early on that the best way to parody LucasArts products was to have a pair of sarcastic wisecracking characters appear in those scenes, with the goal of delivering comedy gold. That duo was, of course, Sam and Max, and from the point that they first appeared in the very first issue of The Adventurer in the fall of 1990, they quickly became fan favorites amongst the countless gamers playing and enjoying LucasArts games. And speaking of the various titles LucasArts had been working on, at the point Sam and Max debuted in The Adventurer issue number 1, the company was in the process of turning into one of the most prominent adventure game studios on the planet, with the release of Maniac Mansion and the creation of the Scum Engine in 1987, followed by popular adventure titles like Zack McCracken, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Loom, and in late 1990, The Secret of Monkey Island. Itself a huge leap from a design perspective over every prior LucasArts adventure that had been released up to that point. LucasArts and their adventure game designers were constantly evolving the state-of-the-art in adventure game storytelling and technology, and with The Secret of Monkey Island, they finally felt like they had struck upon a truly winning formula for delivering deep, engaging, and above all else, fun experiences to gamers around the world. As LucasArts was working to figure out what future titles to begin working on, they began discussing the various options they had in front of them. One option, as you might expect, would be to release new games in pre-existing game series, which is exactly what the company would end up doing for a number of their forthcoming titles, with a sequel to The Secret of Monkey Island releasing in 1991, a standalone pseudo but not really sequel in the Indiana Jones series, The Fate of Atlantis, releasing in 1992, and finally a sequel to Maniac Mansion, Day of the Tentacle, releasing in 1993. Across all of these efforts, the development teams were enthused about the possibility of delivering new adventures for those well-known characters and game series, and the quality of all of these in-development efforts would eventually speak for itself. But LucasArts leadership didn't want the company to rely solely upon creating sequels to games that had come out before, or as extensions of well-known film properties. Undeniably, there was a strong desire to capitalize on those prior successes, and the company, like we just talked about, would do just that with the next 3 game releases they were planning between 1991 and 1993. But the company also wanted to explore the creation of new video game properties, the thought being that another successful game series was just a single popular title away, and if the team could leverage the collective talents of the broader studio, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that they could churn out hit after hit, almost without fail. The only question was, what game would the company greenlight in their quest to find the next big thing? The leadership team took some time to deliberate, but at the end of the day, they realized that the answer to their question was staring them in the face, right from the pages of their very own internally published gaming magazine. Which is why, in 1992, LucasArts leadership would approach Steve Purcell about the possibility of creating a brand new adventure game featuring the comic pairing of anthropomorphic dog and rabbit detectives Sam and Max, an offer that Purcell thought sounded like an amazing opportunity. It didn't take Purcell long to agree to the proposal, and with that, work on the game that would eventually be known as Sam and Max Hit the Road officially got underway. Creating Sam and Max Hit the Road would require the team, which included Purcell as the lead designer, as well as fellow LucasArts employees Sean Clark, Michael Stemley, and Colette Michoud, to figure out exactly what story they wanted to tell, along with how to use LucasArts' proprietary adventure game technology to actually tell that story and allow players to interact with the game's world and its various inhabitants. From a narrative perspective, it didn't take long before the team decided that the best starting point for their interactive Sam and Max adventure was actually a previously written comic book that Purcell published back in 1989, entitled On the Road. In that comic, Sam and Max would be tasked with taking a road trip across the United States, and along the way, they'd encounter a number of different crimes and cases that they'd have to collectively solve. Interestingly, this particular short story was inspired, at least in part, by Purcell's own family road trips that he had taken when he was a child, as he'd often remember visiting various landmarks and popular tourist attractions, only to come away less than impressed with some of the more mundane aspects of those landmarks. Purcell had included some of those locations and related humorous observations in the comics-based story that he had previously written. And with Sam and Max Hit the Road, he decided to add even more landmarks inspired by real-world locations to the game, such as the world's largest ball of twine, Graceland wannabe Bumpusville, and the Mount Rushmore Dinosaur Tar Pit and Bungee Jumping National Park, just to name a few. Those locations and others would end up being visited by the crime-fighting duo throughout their cross-country adventure, which was focused on attempting to find a missing Bigfoot and his carnival companion, Trixie the giraffe-necked girl, both of whom disappeared one day and at the start of the game are nowhere to be found. Purcell and the rest of the team would end up fleshing out that story fairly significantly, and while his original comic On the Road would provide the foundation and inspiration for Hit the Road's eventual narrative, it didn't take long before the scope of the game would expand dramatically beyond the original comic book's plot and story, an outcome that Purcell and the rest of the team hoped would endear Sam and Max Hit the Road to gamers looking for a lengthy, world-spanning point-and-click adventure. As the story was coming into focus, work was also underway on the best way to use the LucasArts Scum engine and various other tools to bring the world of Sam and Max to life. And here, the team decided to both inherit from prior LucasArts titles, as well as evolve beyond what those prior projects were capable of. From a musical perspective, it was decided very early on that Sam and Max would utilize the iMuse music engine, which was the tool that allowed LucasArts composers to create a dynamic soundtrack that tailored itself to player actions taking place on the screen, similar in many ways to how film soundtracks were scored to synchronize with whatever visuals were being shown to theatergoers. An added complexity, however, was the fact that there was no way to know what action a player would take at any given point in time, as unlike the 100% linear format of theatrical films, point-and-click adventure games were anything but linear experiences. This had to be taken into account by the game's composers, LucasArts musical geniuses Clint Bajakian, Peter McConnell, and Michael Land. But considering their prior efforts, deep understanding of the iMuse system, and the fact that all three were incredibly talented musicians, Purcell and the team had no doubt that the game's dynamic soundtrack would end up being a hit amongst gamers who may happen to play Sam & Max after release. And speaking of playing Sam & Max, it was also decided earlier on that Sam & Max would be the latest title to use the Scum engine, a decision that was pretty much a foregone conclusion whenever LucasArts set out to create a new adventure game, simply because of how ubiquitous the Scum engine had become at the company. Here, though, the team didn't want to simply use the traditional Scum interface and gameplay elements to deliver a more of the same kind of approach to adventure gaming. There was a strong desire to evolve the Scum engine beyond what had come before, in the hopes of creating a streamlined interface that hopefully would remain as engaging to use as the prior verb-based command list that formed the foundation of every Scum adventure released up to that point. As Purcell and the team began thinking about how to transform the Scum engine into an even better piece of tech, focus was placed on two major areas: the main verb list and inventory displays that took up the bottom third of every Scum game's interface, and the dialogue tree-based conversation system that allowed players to interact with characters in the game world. Regarding the main interface, the Sam and Max team wanted to do whatever they could to maximize the amount of screen real estate available to the game's artwork, because the team thought that the artwork in the game, as conceptualized by Purcell himself, was definitely a highlight of the experience, and was, in many ways, dramatically better than the art that had appeared in prior adventure games, both from LucasArts as well as from their competitors. This drive to make the game as visually appealing and immersive as possible is what would push the team to reimagine the user interface for the Scum engine, as the text-based verb list that had been prevalent in prior titles was eliminated entirely, replaced by using the right button on your mouse to cycle through a series of icon-based actions that players could use to interact with the world. The inventory display was similarly removed from the main gameplay screen interface, instead replaced by a separate screen entirely that could be overlaid on top of the main gameplay area when the need arose. In this way, the Sam & Max team was able to remove nearly every static interface element from the main gameplay screen, giving them the ability to use every available pixel to deliver high-quality artwork to players, rather than losing the bottom third of the screen to an unchanging and mostly unexciting interface. A similar transformation happened to the game's dialogue system, where instead of displaying text-based options for players to select from when interacting with a character, the team would instead utilize a series of icons that players could select from, effectively hiding the specific text that each character would speak until that character would actually speak it. The decision to tweak the dialogue system in this way was driven primarily by the desire to make the game as funny as possible, as it was widely believed that reading a joke on the screen just wasn't as impactful as hearing the joke in real time. As one of the game's designers, Michael Stemley, pointed out, nothing would kill a joke worse than reading it before you hear it. So, in order to avoid that kind of thing from happening, the text-based interfaces of prior LucasArts titles was removed in favor of less direct graphical representations of various dialogue options. Sam & Max Hit the Road would also introduce several other innovations into the traditional LucasArts adventure game formula, like the inclusion of various minigames that players could mess around with should they so desire, a more mature style of comedy than what had been prevalent in prior LucasArts titles, as well as the fact that the game would feature a fully voiced cast of characters, at least for the CD-ROM version of the game, something that was still a rarity in this era of computer gaming. These additions to the traditional LucasArts adventure game formula, as well as the other technical enhancements we've already talked about, would end up making their way into a number of future LucasArts adventure titles, a true testament to just how innovative the team was attempting to be with Sam & Max's first foray into adventure gaming. Eventually, all of that collective work on Sam & Max would complete, and the game would be released to DOS gamers everywhere in November of 1993. Upon its release, the game would be met with both critical and commercial success, as numerous publications praised the game's art style, witty dialogue, puzzle design, Scum engine enhancements, and legitimately funny writing. All aspects of the game that I'll relay my personal opinion on in just a little bit. There were a couple of more critical reviews though, with some individuals believing the game didn't feel quite as cohesive as other LucasArts adventures, owing largely to the disconnected minigames that were included as part of the overall package. But at the end of the day, the amount of positivity surrounding the game's release far outweighed the more negative critiques. This was further proven out by the game's commercial success, which according to Steve Purcell, was considered to be a hit for LucasArts. While formal sales figures haven't been published, at least to the best of my knowledge, all indications are that Sam & Max was one of the more successful adventure games of the time, and over time the game would be widely recognized as one of the best adventure games ever created. Proof once again that all of the effort that the team behind the game's creation put into the title was absolutely well worth it. With Sam & Max's critical and commercial success, it stands to reason that a sequel would be a foregone conclusion. Only here, there would be a surprising amount of difficulty in bringing a sequel to life. There would be several different attempts at creating a sequel to Sam & Max over the years, though all of those efforts would end up being cancelled at some point in their overall development. Fans of Sam & Max Hit the Road would instead have to wait until 2006 to get their hands on a brand new Sam & Max game, which is when relatively new company Telltale Games would release the first episode in Sam & Max Save the World, an episodic point-and-click adventure that would introduce the titular duo's comedic pursuits to a new generation of gamers, while also serving as a glorious revival for anyone who had been lucky enough to play the original Sam & Max game 13 years prior to this new series release. That 6-episode story arc would be followed by 2 more Telltale-developed Sam & Max releases, all of which followed a similar episodic release schedule and would, similar to Sam & Max Hit the Road, be well-respected and acclaimed amongst the critical and game-playing community. If you were a fan of comic books, however, you didn't have to worry about not having any Sam & Max to occupy your time, because Purcell would continue publishing various Sam & Max-centric comic entries over the years, including both traditional comic book publications in the 1990s, as well as a web-based comic from 2005 to 2007, an effort that would earn Purcell an Eisner Award for Best Digital Comic of 2007. The Eisner Award, for those who may be unaware, is effectively the comic book industry's equivalent of the Academy Awards, so the fact that Purcell won an Eisner Award for his work on Sam & Max is undeniably a big deal. Beyond comics and games, Sam & Max would further be developed into a short-lived 24-episode cartoon series in 1997, an effort that would eventually lead Purcell to begin exploring other opportunities in Hollywood to continue enhancing his own creative talents. This would result in Purcell joining special effects studio Industrial Lights and Magic, followed by a nearly 20-year tenure at Pixar Studios, where he was a member of the senior creative team, contributing to a number of the studio's top films, including Cars, Ratatouille, Brave, Coco, Toy Story 4, and Inside Out 2, amongst others, while also dabbling in some voice work for several of those films. Unfortunately, Purcell would lose his job with Pixar in 2023 as part of a wider Disney company restructuring, and while it's unclear what he's currently working on today, it is clear that Purcell's collective contributions to art, comic books, video gaming, and film remain significant, and in many ways, without equal. Purcell is undoubtedly a talented and creative individual, and I, for one, am hopeful that he continues to use his creative talents to delight fans of his work at some point in the future. Regardless of what that future may hold, though, Purcell's body of work up to this point speaks for itself, and nowhere is that more evident than when looking at his work on Sam & Max, a pair of characters who, in some capacity, has defined Purcell for most of his life. Regardless of whether you're talking about Sam & Max in comic book form or in their adventure game outings, the simple fact is that Purcell succeeded in bringing his brother's childhood creations to the masses, and in the process created a cherished set of memories for countless comic book fans and gamers that will truly never be forgotten. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Sam & Max Hit the Road today versus when it was released over 30 years ago. Sam & Max is, like we talked about, a LucasArts point-and-click adventure, which comes with certain preconceived notions of the overall experience of playing the game. Just like every other LucasArts adventure, and almost every adventure title ever made, your mission is to explore an interconnected game world, where each screen contains a number of hotspots to examine, items to pick up, characters to speak with, and puzzles to solve, all in the hopes of piecing together a central mystery and eventually beating the game. Just hearing that description, you might assume that Sam & Max was simply just another LucasArts adventure, a title that was likely designed well, but didn't exactly do anything different from those titles that came before it. In reality, though, Sam & Max is actually an interesting mix of traditional LucasArts adventure game design combined with brand new innovations and design mechanics, some of which would become the standard for future LucasArts adventure titles that would release in later years. So let's talk about Sam & Max. When you first start up the game and begin playing, you'll likely notice that the interface is dramatically different from the other adventure titles that preceded it, despite the fact that Sam & Max, like nearly every other LucasArts adventure, is a SCUM Engine title. Unlike all SCUM Engine games that came out previously, Sam & Max does not use a traditional static verb command list with an on-screen inventory interface, which had been a staple of LucasArts adventures ever since Maniac Mansion was created, all the way back in 1987. Instead, Sam & Max is the first LucasArts adventure to use an icon-based interface, with commands for walking around the various environments you'll end up exploring, using objects, picking up inventory items, talking to other characters, and examining various items and hotspots, all of which provide a streamlined way for players to interact with the game, while also allowing for more of the game's environment to be displayed on the screen at any point in time, which is a welcome change, as you no longer have to give up half of your visible screen's area to display mostly static interface elements. This, perhaps more than any other aspect of Sam & Max, was a significant innovation over prior titles, and makes the game feel like a much more modern adventure than prior SCUM games. In some ways, Sam & Max acts as a sort of stepping stone to future LucasArts titles, with an interface that, for the most part, works fine, but is not quite as streamlined as what future LucasArts adventures like Full Throttle and The Dig would employ. While the icon interface itself is intuitive, I found cycling through the various commands using the right mouse button to be a bit clunky, and accessing and using items from your inventory, which in Sam & Max is a separate window as opposed to being constantly displayed on the screen, can be a bit cumbersome. That said, for a first attempt at an icon-driven interface, Sam & Max gets a lot right, though it does show its age just a little bit, especially in comparison to later icon-based SCUM Engine titles. One way that Sam & Max doesn't dramatically differ from prior LucasArts adventures is its overall graphical and writing style, which, like most LucasArts adventure games, is designed to be comedic and cartoon-like as opposed to the more serious nature of many Sierra titles, which was LucasArts' primary adventure game competitor from the later 80s through the late 90s. Sam & Max elevates those comedic and cartoon-like elements to a new level, though, as Sam & Max is perhaps the most comedic and cartoon-like LucasArts adventure that had ever been released up to this point in history. While many other LucasArts titles would find humor in certain zany situations, and certain one-liners and other writing styles were used to convey that comedy, I wouldn't consider any prior LucasArts titles to be classified purely as quote-unquote comedies. They were comedic, sure, but pure comedies? I'm not sure I'd characterize them like that. Sam & Max, by contrast, is 100% a comedy through and through, and every aspect of the game, whether the dialogue, the voiceovers you'd hear when examining various objects in the game world, the storyline, or pretty much anything else, was written to be explicitly and intentionally funny. You know how many games that are designed to be comedic are perhaps chuckle-worthy, but don't really make you laugh out loud all that much? Or at least, they don't make you laugh out loud the same way that a really funny movie might? Well, Sam & Max is, from my perspective, a legitimately funny game, with the star of the show being the various interactions between the titular Sam & Max and the different situations they find themselves in. Max, in particular, and his almost psychotic and certainly sociopathic personality is so over the top that you can't help but laugh at his various antics throughout the game, some of which are perhaps the most inappropriate things I've ever seen in a LucasArts adventure. Which basically means Max is absolutely hilarious, as is Sam, as are most of the rest of the game's characters and situations that you'll find yourself in. While Sam & Max might not be quite as funny as a hit comedy you might see in the theaters, it comes surprisingly close, and there were plenty of times throughout my playthrough that the sheer absurdity of the situations I was facing made me legitimately laugh, which is not something I can say about the majority of games that are considered quote-unquote funny. Like I mentioned, one of the funniest aspects of the game are the interactions between Sam and Max, and in a way, the inclusion of Max in the title as a pseudo-sidekick character actually represents another way Sam and Max deviated from the majority of adventure games from around this time. Max as a character is not directly controllable, nor does he act autonomously, but he can be used to solve various puzzles that you may encounter throughout your playthrough, and in this way, Max acts as a form of living inventory item, which is admittedly an interesting approach to implementing a sidekick of sorts. The types of situations that involve using Max in some unexpected way are both hilarious and varied. Though I will say that a couple of puzzles that utilized Max as a solution were a bit less telegraphed than others, making it so that the solution felt a little bit forced, simply to make the player use Max in some interesting, though not always intuitive way. In some cases, I would attempt to solve a puzzle using all of the available items and knowledge I had at my disposal, only to end up using Max as a last resort solution, which ironically ended up being the solution to the puzzle. In those instances, I didn't use Max because I thought that was the right answer to the problem I was trying to solve. I used him because there was no other option that could have conceivably worked, even if some of the options available to me were technically more logical than throwing a hyperkinetic rabbit-like creature into the mix. Now I will say that in almost all instances, using Max to solve a puzzle resulted in laugh-out-loud situations filled with slapstick comedy. I just wish that some of those situations made a little bit more sense prior to solving the puzzle than what they ultimately did. Otherwise, most of the puzzle design in the game is surprisingly logical for a game with such overt references to zany comedy and cartoon-inspired situations. My only other critique as it relates to the puzzle design is that there were a couple so-called puzzles that I ended up solving before I even knew why I was solving that particular puzzle. I don't consider that a major issue with the game, as there are plenty of other adventure games where this kind of thing happens. But in comparison to other LucasArts adventures, in particular those designed by Ron Gilbert and his crew of scumlets, the puzzle design and integration with the game world felt just a little bit less well constructed. Or perhaps a better way to put it is, it felt a little less structured, which led to situations where I took certain actions before I had a real reason to take those actions. Like I said, not a huge deal, but something that did make me scratch my head a couple times as I said to myself, I know this will make sense eventually, but right now, I'm just kind of going through the motions because this puzzle is in front of my face. More straightforward, though still innovative, was the game's dialogue system, which did away with the concept of text-based dialogue trees and instead presented players with a series of icons to both break the ice in one of several ways and ask questions about various topics, ideas, and items that you may have encountered while playing the game. I have to admit, I'm a bit torn about this one, because on one hand, I appreciated the more visual dialogue system, and in many ways, this style of dialogue would be similar to that found in Revolution Software's Broken Sword series, which I absolutely loved. The thing is though, with Sam and Max, while the visual dialogue entries were cool to look at and conceptually made sense, they felt a bit less fleshed out than prior LucasArts titles. Or at a minimum, it made the dialogues in Sam & Max feel less deep than I would have preferred. The way it works is, once you break the ice with a given character, either by asking them a general question, declaring something to them, or making a comment that is totally off the wall, you're given the opportunity to ask about any topic that might be pertinent to your investigation, as long as that topic is semi-relevant to the person you're speaking with. So, let's say you're trying to ask about a missing person. You walk up to someone who might know something about that missing person, and wanting to find out more information, you click on the icon that looks like that person. That lets the person you're speaking with relay some sort of information to you that may or may not help in your investigation. And then, well, that's pretty much it as far as that topic goes. While you do often have the option of asking about the missing person again, most of the time, the question is something like, "Are you sure you don't know anything else about that missing person?" To which the computer-controlled character replies something to the equivalent of, "Yes, I'm sure." I felt like prior LucasArts titles that used dialogue trees for conversations allowed for deeper, more engaging discussions about various topics, and also provided an opportunity for dialogue to become a puzzle itself, whereas in Sam & Max, most dialogue is much more straightforward, which is good from a streamlining perspective, but not necessarily as good from an adventure game standpoint. It's not that I disliked it, and I thought the conversations, writing, and voice acting were superb. I just kind of wanted more of that dialogue, which I felt was missing due to the almost too streamlined nature of the dialogue system in the game. Now, an area I thought Sam & Max did better than almost any other adventure game I've played is the way that navigating between locations work, and in particular, how you discover different locations to explore that subsequently appear on your map. In Sam & Max, you're tasked with taking on a cross-country investigation, and over the course of your playthrough, you're going to visit tons of different locations from literally across the entire United States. From gator-infested Florida golf courses to the world's biggest ball of yarn, which by the way is in Minnesota, to real-world, albeit caricatured, national monuments, to any number of other interesting to explore areas. Generally speaking, all of these locations are interesting to explore, and the way puzzles in one location might intersect with other locations is one of the staples of LucasArts adventures, and that particular highlight is fully on display here. What I really enjoyed though, and this is going to sound like a small thing, is the way new locations are added to your map. As you explore a given location, you're probably going to talk to everyone in sight, and you're definitely going to pick up everything you possibly can. Because, well, that's simply what you do in adventure games. Well, occasionally, you might pick up an item that upon further examination will have some sort of address on it. When you find an item like that, you'll hear a brief narration from either Sam or Max, and then the map screen will appear as that new location is added as an explorable area. I thought this was an awesome touch, and the fact that locations got added to the map in real time after discovering a certain piece of information or specific item made it feel like I was an actual detective investigating the scene of a crime, which felt legitimately awesome. It's a super small touch, and one that I didn't anticipate having an impact on me when I began playing the game, but it truly did make the game feel more engaging, especially when compared to most adventure games where you find a piece of information and then the next time you look at your map, that new location is simply there, ready to be traveled to. Tying the unveiling of a location to the specific action in-game that you took made it feel like you were doing the investigating, as opposed to being a passive observer in an otherwise predefined narrative. I'm curious if anyone else had a similar feeling when playing the game. If so, definitely let me know. Oh, by the way, the other side effect of these kinds of location reveals is that you never knew how the adventure was going to unfold, or to what strange location you'd be directed to explore next. And there were even times when multiple locations would be added to the map at the same time, giving you a degree of choice as to how you were going to proceed with your investigation. In all instances, a truly cool touch that made the game surprisingly more engaging, at least to me. One of the other ways Sam & Max differed from other adventure titles is in the number of completely unnecessary side activities the game provided for players to partake in, all of which amounted to simple time wasters, some of which were surprisingly fun. Besides the integrated required minigames that you need to complete in order to progress in the game, like a riveting round of whack-a-mole and a simplified golf driving range experience, there are also a bunch of other activities you can complete that serve no real purpose. These include things like working on a Sam & Max coloring book, dressing paper doll versions of the titular characters up with various costumes, riding down a cross-country highway with Max on the roof of your car as you attempt to avoid road signs, and my personal favorite, an interactive, fully playable version of Battleship, which in the game is rebranded as Car Bomb in order to avoid copyright issues, as Sam & Max helpfully explain. I admit, I spent way too much time playing Car Bomb, because the core framework of Battleship, and Car Bomb by extension, is just a good game, and pretty much never gets old. It has been years since I played Battleship properly, and now that I played Car Bomb while playing Sam & Max, I really want to dust off my old electronic Battleship board game and play it with my daughter. That's how good Car Bomb was. It made me want to play the original on which it was based. Anyway, these minigames were all cool inclusions, though ultimately entirely unnecessary to your progression in the game. And speaking of being unnecessary, there were also a number of other unnecessary interactions and characters peppered throughout the title, all of which served to add additional flavor and context to the overall world, but did, in some instances, make me wish that there was more to do with some of these optional encounters. It's not that those optional interactions, lines of dialogue, and characters were bad. Far from it. In fact, overall, the game was so good that I really wanted it to continue well beyond its defined playtime, which felt just a little bit short to me. At a minimum, it was a shorter experience than what I wanted, because I was enjoying the game so much that I did not want it to end. That being said, the game does a good job of extending its playtime a bit further than what your original quest would suggest, which I appreciated. The unfortunate thing is that by the time you reach the end sections of the game, when you discover that there's actually more to do than you first anticipated, you'll realize that the final endgame puzzle is practically solved for you already, just based on actions you had already taken while exploring the game world. This is a prime example of something I had mentioned earlier, where you sometimes complete a puzzle that's presented to you just because it's there, not realizing why you completed that puzzle until later in the game. The final set of endgame puzzles falls into this trap, where it's cool that you finally found a use for some of the items you've collected over the course of your adventure, but is ultimately more shallow than I was hoping from an endgame puzzle. I would have wanted a set of massive, interconnected, outside-the-box kind of logical leaps to bring the game to its finale, but instead, all I got was the equivalent of interpreting some pictures and matching the right items to those pictures. I really wanted more here, and ultimately, the end of the game felt like a bit of an anticlimax, especially considering that the main threat and story thread that had been prevalent in the game up to that point felt much higher stakes than the final set of endgame puzzles. This is a relatively minor critique in the grand scheme of things, but it is something I wish had been designed just a bit differently. I do have more thoughts on the game that I'd like to share, but we'll get to those as we talk about the more specific aspects of the game. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have gameplay videos to look up and see what a game was like. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based on word of mouth from family and friends, game reviews that we might have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like in the game store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Sam and Max Hit the Road for the MS-DOS computer platform, the back of the box says, "Yikes! Grab your nightstick, squeal like a siren, and hit the road with Sam and Max, freelance police, as they attempt to crack their toughest case. Sam, a canine Seamus, and Max, a hyperkinetic rabbity thing, are hot on the trail of a runaway carnival Bigfoot across America's quirky underbelly in this deranged animated adventure. Help our frightening fairy flatfoots find the fugitive freak. Do it now." And some bullets. Enjoy edgy animation and twisted humor. Endless hours of fun playing minigames like Whack-A-Rat and Car Bomb. Indulge in gratuitous antisocial behavior. Stop at tacky tourist traps and intimidate their bizarre denizens. See colossal full-screen graphics. Easy pop-up verb and dialogue icons. And then there are some screenshots with some captions on the back of the box that show various situations in the game, and a little mini comic strip at the bottom where they have Sam and Max talking, and they say, "I can't think of anything more relaxing than being locked in a moving car with a delusional psychotic like yourself, little pal." And then the reply being, "That's really sweet, Sam. I may weep openly." And then that's the back of the box, and yep, this one sells me. 150 million%, this one sells me. The graphics look so good and so cartoon-like. The humor is fully on display here. This is a perfect game box. This totally sells the experience of playing the game and absolutely sells me on it. Now, I did own Sam and Max when I was younger, but I did not own the boxed copy. I got in one of those compilation collections that oftentimes came out with different LucasArts collection of games. I think it was one of the LucasArts official volumes with collections that had Sam and Max in it. So I had the CD, but I did not have the box. Looking at the box today, I want this on my shelf. Anyway, moving past the box to talk more about the specific aspects of the game, we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Sam & Max are some of the finest cartoon-styled visuals that you're going to see in a LucasArts adventure title, and in fact, are some of the finest cartoon-styled visuals that you're going to see in any game, period, from the early to mid-90s. The level of quality here was unlike anything I was expecting, and every interaction that you could take in the game was accompanied by a smooth animation that perfectly captured the essence of both the interaction and the scene, in a way that few games can match. You know how in many adventure games, when you're going to use an item, there might be a short pre-canned animation, but generally speaking, the animation is still a bit generic, or at a minimum isn't all that highly detailed? Well, that never happens in Sam & Max, as every single animation, interaction, dialogue, everything in the game felt lovingly handcrafted in a way that made the game feel like an interactive cartoon, more so than the majority of titles that I've played, including modern games. And that's not even talking about the high-quality visuals in each of the game's environments, all of which look like they were ripped straight out of the pages of a comic book, which I guess makes sense considering Sam & Max originated as a comic strip in the late 80s. The conversion of comic strip and cartoon-style visuals into a digital format worked flawlessly here, and I have to commend the game's art team for creating an awesome experience that was truly a feast for the eyes. Amazing graphical work. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in Sam & Max is all excellent, with a number of different themes using different styles of music, all of which mesh perfectly with the scenes you're exploring and the action taking place on the screen. In particular, I loved the game's main theme, which felt like a mix of buddy cop television show mixed with slapstick Naked Gun styled comedy, which honestly, I think is kind of the sweet spot for this particular game. The bottom line is, the music is amazing, and as I listened to the soundtrack after playing the game in full, I came to appreciate it even more. It is simply top-notch. Not to be outdone, though, is the voice acting, which is some of the best voice acting you're going to hear in all of adventure gaming. Now, LucasArts, generally speaking, was always focused on delivering high-quality voice acting in their games, at least after they began releasing talkie versions of their experiences, so I wouldn't have expected the voice acting in Sam & Max to be anything other than good. But the voice acting in Sam & Max is far better than good. It's phenomenal, and in particular, I loved the voice acting for both Sam as a caricatured version of a hard-boiled detective kind of character, and Max as a psychotic, kind of New York accented bunny who truly has no morals, scruples, or filter. All the voice acting in the game is great, but Sam and Max, those voices made the experience amazing. Of course, the quality of the writing helped too. But the best writing in the world won't amount to much if the lines can't be delivered convincingly and with emotion. And here, Sam & Max definitely succeeds. If you've never experienced the talkie version of the title, definitely go out of your way to play it. The voice acting adds something truly special to the game. Awesome voice work all around. The bottom line is that I have no complaints about the sound or music, as the auditory environment in the game greatly enhances the experience of playing the game. Simply amazing. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Sam and Max, members of the freelance police. After a short introductory sequence involving a kidnapped woman and a robotic mad scientist that eventually results in an explosive head being tossed outside of your office window, don't ask, you get your new orders from your commissioner. A pair of circus performers, Trixie the giraffe-necked lady and Bruno the Bigfoot, have gone missing, and there's only one dynamic duo that can potentially solve the case, that being Sam and Max. You'll go on a cross-country comedy adventure as you try to learn what happened to Trixie and Bruno, and along the way, you'll uncover a plot that threatens the very existence of an entire species of creatures. Can you save Bruno and Trixie while making the world a better place for everyone? There's only one way to find out. I've got to say, I absolutely loved the story here, which did a great job of mixing comedy with a dash of mystery and a couple shakes of detective adventure, all of which came together into a really engaging, ultimately fulfilling narrative. Like I mentioned earlier, my primary complaint about the game's story is the fact that there isn't more of it, as I became strangely enthralled with the fates of all of the characters in the game, while also becoming strangely addicted to Sam and Max's unique blend of over-the-top, slightly sociopathic comedy. This is one of those games where the story is light and breezy, but still deeply engaging, a combination that very few games can pull off successfully. Sam and Max succeeds here. And while I do wish the game was even longer, I can't really complain about a game and narrative that don't overstay their welcome. Overall, a well-constructed, extremely well-written narrative and story. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a fair amount about the game's general structure and controls, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I will reiterate, though, is that the game's shift from traditional text-based verb command lists to a more graphical, icon-based interface really did make the game feel much more modern than other LucasArts adventures that preceded it, and that transition would set the stage for every LucasArts adventure that would follow. While I did find the controls to be a little clunky at times, this was nothing that impacted my enjoyment of the game. As long as you're familiar with general adventure game gameplay, you shouldn't have any issues here. As far as playability goes, I actually found Sam & Max to be a tad easier than I had anticipated, as individual puzzles and integrated puzzle chains all seem to be a bit simpler than those you might find in other Lucas Adventure titles like the Monkey Island series and Day of the Tentacle. The puzzles in Sam & Max, while well designed, felt a little less deep than the experiences in those titles, where I might spend a fair chunk of time simply trying to decipher how all of the interconnected pieces are supposed to come together, independent of actually solving the underlying puzzles themselves. In Sam & Max, I never hit a situation where I felt stuck, and there were no puzzles here that really felt all that challenging, which I'm assuming was an intentional design decision to keep the game more focused on comedy as opposed to brain-melting puzzle dependency chains. I don't think this is a bad thing per se, it's just that I had a certain preconceived notion of the level of puzzle engagement I was expecting from a LucasArts adventure, and I found Sam & Max to be less fully developed in that area. That being said, I did hit one snag during my playthrough that took some time to figure out, but unfortunately, it wasn't because I was trying to solve a particularly challenging puzzle, it was simply because I didn't realize a specific environmental hotspot contained an inventory item I could pick up, which from my perspective was a slight miss on both my part, as well as the part of the game. I've spoken before about the need for adventure games to appropriately telegraph when an item can actually be picked up, versus when an item is simply window dressing and designed to provide flavor for the environment. The best adventure games allow individuals to clearly see when something is likely an item that can be picked up, without making it so overt that it feels like you're looking at graphics that sit on top of the background scenes in the game. With Sam & Max, you have a game that almost universally has great telegraphing, aside from one singular item that you should be able to pick up early in your playthrough that I completely missed. Like I said, I accept part of the blame here, but I also feel like the game could have made that one item just a bit clearer for players to understand it was usable in some context other than providing background info for the scene in which it was found. This is ultimately a very minor critique, but it is something I felt warranted mentioning. Otherwise, there was just one other puzzle that I had a bit difficulty in solving, primarily because of the logical leap needed to realize that a certain object could be modified by a certain character to create an entirely different object. This one stung a little bit, because I feel like I should have gotten it, but I just didn't think about the situation the right way. I admit I had to resort to a guide for that one puzzle, and as soon as I saw the solution, I immediately kicked myself. That is the definition of a good puzzle, in that you should have figured it out, but ultimately couldn't figure it out, so I applaud the team for this one late game puzzle. Obviously, no spoilers here, but if anyone is curious which puzzle I'm talking about, feel free to shoot me a note, and we can discuss. Overall, Sam & Max felt like a breath of fresh air, and presented me with a LucasArts adventure that was both familiar and traditional, as well as new and innovative, and the unique combination of all of those aspects of the game made for an experience that, from my perspective, will be difficult to forget. So, what is our verdict on Sam & Max Hit the Road? Well, Sam & Max is not a perfect adventure game, but in many ways, the reason it's not perfect is because it truly does feel like a bridge between the LucasArts classic adventures of the later 80s and early 90s to the LucasArts more technologically advanced adventures of the later 90s. The transition to an icon-based interface as opposed to the older SCUM verb list, the simplification of the dialogue system, the easier puzzles and dependency chains, the more advanced visuals, animations, and comedy writing, all of those things were direct evolutions over the LucasArts titles that preceded the game, some of which really worked for me, while others I felt were a bit too much of a deviation from what made older LucasArts titles so deep and engaging. From my perspective, Sam & Max does have some flaws. But you know what? The quality of the writing, the comedy of the situations and the dialogues, the breeziness of the story, the outstanding music, all of those things far outweigh any of the critiques I've levied at the game. And at the end of the day, I spent my hours playing Sam & Max with a smile on my face from beginning to end. Which is why, for me, Sam & Max is absolutely deserving of a spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is one of those games that, despite having some flaws, is still a remarkable experience, and is one that I have no reservations recommending as a title that everyone should play at some point in their gaming careers. From a personal perspective, I do believe there are better adventure games out there, both from LucasArts and others, but that does not diminish the quality of Sam & Max as a standalone experience, and it has therefore just become the newest inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming.
I remember my childhood in Brighton, when dear old Dad would bounce me on his knee. He'd say, son, there ain't nothing as exciting as exposing beasts to inhumanity. That's why I'm happy to be king of the creatures. I'm proud to be the lord of the old. I love collecting things with grotesque features. It makes me feel like some Chaldean god. Oh, I trapped my first tiger before I could speak. Killed me a bear when I was 3. And now with this Bigfoot and giraffe-necked freak, I finally have a full menagerie. Hit it, boys!
That's why beasts have been feared by the one, just to be the sorrow of us all. None of us can be what we are one of.
Oh, it's tough to be a country western star.
That was our episode on Sam & Max Hit the Road. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Diablo, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Diablo. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.